Welcome back. This is the second lecture for biogeochemical cycles. If you're here, you should be from Miss Kennedy's class. If not, welcome. So we're going to focus today on phosphorus and sulfur, and I promise these two cycles are a lot shorter than the last three, so just bear with me and we'll be done pretty soon. So we're going to jump right in to talk about the phosphorus cycle. So it's pretty similar to the nitrogen cycle. There are some overlap that I want to get into. So phosphorus helps us with things like our DNA and our RNA, and it helps us to make ATP, which is energy. So that exercise we did today in class, we used a little bit of phosphorus was involved in our workout today because there was energy involved, and phosphorus helps to generate energy. So it's pretty important. It's also a limiting nutrient, which we learned about with the nitrogen cycle. There's not that much of it in certain systems, so without it, things don't grow as well when it runs out, because there's already so little of it. So it's a limiting nutrient, but not a little bit different than phosphorus. There is no gas phase a little bit different than nitrogen. There's no gas phase to phosphorus. It always stays in the form that we call phosphate, and it looks a little bit like this. Okay? And it rarely changes from phosphate. Which is nice, a little easier to remember. There's not that much change. But what is important to note about phosphorus is that there's still cycles, and each different section of the cycle is broken up into two simple groups that we've been talking about as well. So we have our biotic parts of the cycle that are basically done by the living, and then we have the abiotic. So we'll get into both of those, and you'll kind of start to see why they're each biotic and abiotic. So the first two cycles in the phosphorus cycle are assimilation and mineralization. I apologize for the handwriting. It's not ever going to get any bit better. Okay, so assimilation and mineralization are the first two phases of the biotic cycle. Okay, and assimilation is basically just that excuse me, producers here, we see them right over here. Producers take in phosphates from the soil. They absorb them into their tissues. They assimilate them into their tissues and slowly start to use them. And then when those producers die, and the consumers that eat the producers, the decomposers will come in and break down the phosphorus that was in the producers, and eventually the phosphates that were in the producers will be mineralized back into an inorganic phosphate. So it basically just goes right back into the soil. So this little cycle here is kind of self-contained. It just stays within the grass, goes to the plants, goes to the decomposers, then back to the grass or the soil. So that's pretty simple. So that's the assimilation phase, our cycle. And the second cycle we're going to talk about here in the biotic section is mineralization. Okay, and that's pretty simple. That's just what we spoke about with the phosphates being mineralized by decomposers as they're getting broken down. They come from the plants, basically. The plants use them in their tissues, and they get turned back into phosphates in the soil. Okay? And that's where they're really mineralized. And in the plants, that's where they're assimilated. So you have two living things helping you out in this cycle, which is why it is biotic. Okay, you have the plants that are helping you, and you have the decomposers helping you at this phase of mineralization. So that's really where you get your life, is your decomposers breaking things down and your plants taking in that phosphate. So those are the two biotic cycles. The abiotic cycles are pretty simple and pretty similar to nitrogen. So we have sedimentation, geologic uplift, and we have weathering. Easy, very, very simple to understand, and all non-living. Okay? So We've talked about sedimentation before, but it's this very simple process where phosphates eventually move into the water and they slowly become built into sediment or rock. So over time, the phosphates will build up into phosphate rocks, which you're seeing here. So that's your first phase, that's sedimentation, which is occurring in the rocks. And then over time, those rocks will rise into mountains and become, something in the actual ecosystem. And those mountains will start to rise in a process called geologic uplift, which you're seeing right here. So the rocks start under the ocean, they rise up through geologic uplift, which takes a very long time. Once they're out in the open, then a process begins called weathering. So here we have some weathering occurring just from natural cycles like the sun, the heat, the rain, the snow. Those things kind of break off some phosphates from the rocks. Okay, and then once that happens, once the phosphates are off the rocks, they can go a bunch of places. They can go into the water, they can go into land cycles, and all those sorts of things. So that's weathering. And it all started with that sedimentation, the geologic uplift that pulls the sediment out of the ocean, and then the weathering that removes the rocks, the phosphates from the rocks. So those are our cycles. And it's important to note that phosphate doesn't really leach, meaning it doesn't really move through an environment very easily. It's not like it starts to leak everywhere because it's a limiting nutrient. It's not seen very often. So there's very little leaching going on unless it's caused by humans. So we're about to get into that right now. Okay? Excuse me. Pretty simple human impacts that we're going to talk about. Humans mine, meaning they kind of rip out rocks from the earth. They rip out those phosphate rocks so that they can use phosphates. So they use them in things like fertilizer. And we've talked about this before, but I want to make sure you understand why. So fertilizers are used to help grow crops. So if we have if you have a big 10,000 acre farm full of corn, you want that corn to do well because there's a lot of money in that corn. So you're going to want to enhance and create really strong fertilizers to help your farm be successful. And to do that, you need things like phosphates and nitrogen. So we mine phosphate and we mine nitrogen so we can add them to our fertilizers and make our crops better. So that's the reason why we're doing these things. But as we do these things, as we mine phosphates, a couple things are going to occur. We're involved in the cycle, that's fine, we can take phosphates, but once we add those fertilizers to land, we have that leaching process. And I mentioned that there's not very much leaching in the natural cycle, but once we start to add those fertilizers, that's when we get more leaching. And leaching will lead to runoff, basically, of phosphorus into oceans. And that's not really a good thing. We don't need a bunch of phosphorus in the oceans because phosphorus is a limiting nutrient in the ocean, especially in aquatic systems because there's not so much of it in this system already, so adding more of it can be pretty damaging. So I'm going to explain how, and then we'll be pretty much done with the phosphorus cycle. So basically when phosphorus is added to an ocean system, you get an excess of phosphorus coming in. I'm just going to put P for phosphorus from some sort of farm. The producers here, the plants, we're going to call them algae, because that's a very common plant. They start to grow like crazy. They blow up because they have all this phosphorus coming in. They take it and they grow. Eventually they will die, as sad as it is, and in their death some decomposers will come and start to break down all the dead algae, which is good because it's a natural cycle. So they want to kind of break them down and recycle them and return the phosphorus and then other nutrients to the other cycles. But as they do this breaking down process, this uses tons of oxygen. This actually takes oxygen. Sorry, that says takes oxygen from the ocean, from the water. So this process is now removing oxygen from the ocean or the whatever system it's in. So every single thing below this algal bloom that's breaking down has no oxygen. There's no oxygen anywhere. And if there's no oxygen, that means there is no life. Everything is dead. No sharks can live, no fish can live, nothing. So this area, we refer to this as a dead zone, actually, when there's no O2. It's called a dead zone. which is not a good thing. I know I'm doing a lot of sad faces. Okay, we also, I'm going to bring you all the way over here, sorry. The scientific term for a dead zone is a hypoxic zone. Hypoxic just means no oxygen. So when you have no oxygen, you have a dead zone. And again, there's no oxygen because the decomposers have used it all up. So that becomes a really problematic thing in our oceans, because if we don't have oxygen in important parts of the ocean, we can't have life. And if we can't have life, then our planet's going to start to change. So algal blooms are pretty concerning in certain areas, certain aquatic systems, and that's caused by humans. That runoff from humans can lead to this problem. Alright, so that's the phosphorus cycle. It's super simple. I'm going to keep it short. We're not even going to get too far into it, but the sulfur cycle helps organisms to use oxygen, which is great for us. Very, very simple. Sulfur exists in rocks. There's a lot of areas on Earth where there's sulfur, and as slowly as rocks start to weather, some sulfur will be released into the atmosphere, which is what you see here. So there's some sulfur in our atmosphere naturally. Also, volcanic eruptions, when these blow, they release some sulfur as well, and that's in the form of SO2. So there is some sulfur naturally in our environment, but of course, as we're learning, fossil fuels, mining and combusting fossil fuels creates that additional arrow that adds even more SO2 or sulfur to our atmosphere. And the bummer about this, which is kind of already the human impact, so we're going to go right into it, is when we add too much sulfur to the atmosphere, some bad things can happen. So sulfur, which is SO2, will meet water in the atmosphere whenever there's clouds, and it will form something called sulfuric acid, which sounds like a fancy science name, but basically, maybe if you've heard of this, is known as acid rain. And you'll see in this picture right here, acid rain. Acid rain going down onto our Earth is not a good thing, and it does affect our ecosystem. So this acid rain is caused by excess sulfur in the atmosphere meeting with water in the clouds, which is a natural thing. But when they combine in this huge excess that we have because of fossil fuels, we get a lot more acid rain. And acid rain can be harmful for ecosystems. So that's about it for sulfur. That's all you really need to know, is that it can lead to acid rain. It's pretty simple, but that is the key. Alright, so hopefully you feel comfortable with that. That's it for this lecture. If you have questions, please come to class ready to talk about them, and I hope you took some notes and enjoy. Bye-bye.